Welcome back to Circus Z. This is the third and final episode of the season, and we have a very special guest, Viren Beruwalage from the University of St. Andrews. Hi, Viren. How are you?
Hi, Vipulesh. It's an honor to be here.
Pleasure's mine. So Viren and I thought it would be interesting to discuss hot topics on the news, and something that's been popping up a lot is the Trump impeachment and the whole US insurrection. And I thought I'd get Virian's take on it before we kind of discuss the whole situation.
Perfect. Thanks, Vipulesh, again. So when it comes to uh, looking at what has unfolded in the US over the past month or so, I think we need to look at the main event, or the spark that resulted in everything going downhill, not only for Donald Trump, but also his legacy, uh, not only for Donald Trump uh, as an individual, but also for his legacy as a former US president. So, for those of you who may not be well aware about what unfolded in early January, uh, so the insurrection was basically an attack against the 117th US Congress at US Capitol, where you had a mob of Donald Trump supporters um, rioting, protesting, looting, etc. And why was it a significant day? It was because um, the the because Congress was proceeding with a recount of the electoral college vote, um, and this mob of supporters were trying to just disrupt, delay, and overturn the initial count, which was in Joe Biden's favor. Um, and the aim of this, as I said earlier, was merely to disrupt, delay, and overturn that, and to also pressure Congress and the vice president at the time, Mike Pence, to overturn the election of Joe Biden. So initially, if you've just heard this right now, you may think that this is independent of the Trump regime and that this was just an act carried out by a mob of Trump supporters who may be independent of any association or direct link to the president. But this is where we draw links to Donald Trump and his regime, and also draw links to the second impeachment trial hearing uh, that unfolded. So, why is this a black mark for Donald Trump and Donald Trump's presidency? It's because uh, ever since the electoral college vote count started off immediately after the election, Donald Trump would falsely claim that that there was election fraud, that this was a fake election, that the results are illegitimate, and that uh, the Democrats have slipped up in terms of being fair, and also this 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 insurrection goes down as a post-election act of violence. And through his unchecked tweets and the barbaric lies on Twitter, all these supporters were aggravated, and all of them were enticed into carrying out uh, this act against Congress. Because and he said, and I quote, he said this on the eve of the insurrection, where he put up a tweet where he said, "If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." Unquote. And when you have a group of followers who idol worship you, and a group of supporters who hold you on a pedestal throughout your presidency, and when you have a group of supporters who might also be uneducated and who might be just very, very impressionable, it's tweets like this that can provoke the actions uh, that took place during the insurrection. So this is what resulted in Trump having to undergo a second impeachment trial for the incitement and I quote, the incitement of insurrection. And he was impeached for the second time on the 13th of January, and he also became it was also the first impeachment in which all majority caucus members voted unanimously for impeachment. And why this was significant was because 10 Republican representatives also voted for him to be impeached for a second time. And this was the most pro-impeachment votes ever from a president's party. And Vipulesh, I think we could talk about potential consequences of this and what this could mean, not only for Donald Trump, but for the Republicans and the US as a
Yeah,
whole.
so along those lines, when the whole impeachment trial was taking place, there was a lot of debate on whether it was, right to impeach a president who's lost the election and has already left office. And well, in my case at least, I believe that even if a president has left office, there still has to be a trial for whatever crime that was committed during the presidency.
I completely agree. I think when it comes to things like diplomatic immunity, uh, of course, there has to be some form of immunity given whilst you're in power, merely for the sake of protecting you against extremists, against non-state actors who might look to pose a threat to you. But when it comes to this impeachment trial, I think there are two things we need to look at, right? Firstly, it's the fact that there are everyone thinks that this is a trial in hindsight. And what do I mean by that? That it's a trial that is purely based on events that have unfolded in the past. But I think it's especially in the context of Donald Trump. And as I said earlier, he's very unique and different to other presidential candidates or former presidents. He has a huge clout around him, right? You have your white supremacists in America, and you have a certain fraction of them who will continue to idolize and support Donald Trump for being very American as a president. And this was seen during his tenure, where he prioritized domestic employment, prioritized the well-being of Americans through having immigration restrictions imposed for uh, foreigners, uh, and pretty much intensely against Mexican immigrants coming in. So you had this mentality that was nurtured during his time as president, and that was something that catered to most of these white supremacist Americans who not only voted for him in 2020, but also voted him into power in 2016 to begin with. Going back to what I was talking about in terms of him having this clout, and it's this very, and when you have these white supremacists, etc., who were whose needs were catered to during his time of presidency through his anti-immigration policies, through making sure that in his policies in terms of catering to their employment needs and making sure that these Americans were prioritized over any and all others. I think at that point, and this is something we saw in January when during the insurrection, was that these supporters are going to remain by Donald Trump's side. And as he said, and I quote in November when he said, "Stand back and stand by." These guys will continue to stand back and stand by his side even in his post-presidential era. And at that point, this impeachment trial becomes very relevant, because if he is in fact impeached, and as he was, and if the trial does go ahead, and if the trial also determines gives him a negative outcome, he is unable to hold slash run for any position related to public office in the future. And what this does is it prevents him from coming back and running for re-election, or running to be elected in 2024. And it is almost guaranteed that all these white supremacist, racist supporters on his side will continue to be there by his side, because he was very impressionable during his 4 years in power, and so he has an unprecedented clout, unlike any other U.S. president. If this was for any other U.S. president, I could see where the anti-impeachment trial viewers were coming in from, in saying that this has no bearing or consequence on things that will happen in the future. But seeing that Donald Trump has a certain group of supporters who will inevitably give him all the support he needs if he ever runs for election again, I think it becomes a lot more significant.
Uh, Going back in time to 2016, when Donald Trump was initially running for office, at least in my eyes, it just seemed like a complete joke. It looked like, Hillary Clinton was going to just win by landslide, and he was just going to be like this comic relief in the 2016 election, but he won, and it was quite shocking. But then it kind of turned into this whole thing where his presidency was just uh, filled with, news coverage and social media coverage and misinformation, to the point where the citizens who did take part in the insurrection of the Capitol were literally live streaming themselves onto social media, posting pictures of them committing treason in the Capitol building. And it was shocking to see that the severity of things like treason, the severity of storming the most important building in the country, just had turned into a joke, and how like the seriousness of US politics kind of fell from 2016 to the current state that it is in 2020
I
or
I agree with
2021.
you completely. Going back to 2016, and I think this is something important for all our listeners as well. Uh, there is a great documentary on Netflix called The Great Hack, which outlines Cambridge Analytica's involvement in Donald Trump's election campaign in 2016. So, for those of you who may not have time to watch it, I'll just give you a brief outline as to what his methods were. So, as you know, when he ran against Hillary Clinton was someone who had political baggage on her side, right? Her husband, Bill Clinton, was the former president, so and she was always involved in politics. So she had political baggage was representing the Democrats. Whereas Donald Trump was a left field pick at the time, someone who barely engaged with politics to begin with. He was known as a whiz kid on the. Ever since he was a kid, he was known as one of the smartest. He had one of the smartest minds and intellects for a businessman in America. He was a reputed billionaire at the time, so he came in as a left field, non-traditional pick. And at the time, right in the run-up to the election, everyone thought it would be a landslide victory for Hillary Clinton, purely based on the fact that they never thought that a very traditional America would opt for a left field pick. So what this documentary does is it outlines how Cambridge Analytica, who was involved in Donald Trump's election campaign, infringed the right of privacy of many Americans on Facebook. So what they did was they they look at a certain sample in society. So they look at an age group from 18 to 30. Why was that age group relevant? Because that was the age group that was either getting very involved in politics, or an age group that can be influenced, or a group of voters that could be influenced to swing the other way because they were still very young. So what they did was they'd go on to most Facebook accounts. If they found out on your feed that you were an outright Democrat supporter, they leave you alone. If they found out that you were a outright Republican supporter who will inevitably vote for Trump, they'd leave you alone. So because in America, because many youngsters at the time were rather apathetic, they were apathetic voters who didn't really care about elections, didn't really care about American politics, and never felt the need to go out and vote. Um, they targeted that demographic, and what they did was they'd send you, they'd they'd they'd, they'd load your feed with anti-Hillary Clinton posts that would posters that would read the following by saying things along the likes of, "Oh, Hillary Clinton to destroy America," or "Do you want Bill again?" or things, very short captions that would trigger you into starting to dislike Hillary Clinton, and whilst doing so, give you positive material and content to engage with about Donald Trump. So, if putting myself in a hypothetical situation, if I was an apathetic US voter who never really cared, a US 18-year-old voting 2016, who didn't really care about politics, my parents don't really care about politics, and I just go on Facebook every day and continue to see anti-Hillary Clinton posts because it works with my psyche. I'm more likely to now start supporting Donald Trump, reading up a bit on Donald Trump, and actively going out in November 2016 and voting for Donald Trump. So why was this a huge case? Because they thought that it infringed upon the right to privacy of individuals by merely hacking their accounts to determine whether they could be influenced and brainwashed. And this in itself led to Cambridge Analytica being Cambridge Analytica's operations being suspended. It led to Cambridge Analytica becoming a defunct organization because of their involvement in such an illegitimate campaign. So it was pretty clear from the onset that Donald Trump was going to create chaos in the US. And it was just a matter of time, in my opinion, before America voted him out. And my prediction came true with Joe Biden winning the election towards the end of last year.
With regards to elections and democratic process that most of the countries follow, do you feel like the one and only, true power that the citizens have, which is their vote, has been completely undermined by political strategies in the recent past, with obviously the insurrection, analytics companies stepping in to influence voters, and even in Sri Lanka, where the people vote for one prime minister and another is brought into power halfway through the administrative period.
I agree with you. I think if you had to look at elections and election protocol, right, it's quite. Why was this insurrection very significant? It's because going back to all our elections in developing countries, be it India, be it Sri Lanka, be it Pakistan, be it Bangladesh, any of the subcontinental countries, we always held the US and the UK as symbols, as role models to follow in terms of their democratic processes. When you have things like an independent election commission overseeing our elections, it's usually following those Western standards and protocols. And when you have countries like the US trying to impose uh, their power over developing countries whenever developing countries proceed with an election, it was quite ironic and rather comical that the US found themselves in a situation where there were election violations being committed in the post-election period during the insurrection. And it was quite funny to see how an incumbent president would undermine the very election process that got him into power in 2016. And why do I say incumbent? It was even before Biden was confirmed as president, ever since the first results came out, Donald Trump would put up tweets saying, these are fake results. These are not the results that America voted upon. This is not what America needs. And it was quite funny that an incumbent president would undermine his or her own electoral process. And I think that was rather comical, considering the fact that they tried to impose those aforementioned protocols in developing countries. And I also think, going back to what you said about how um, it has become it isn't the case of being black and white anymore about how elections run and the fairness of elections. I think a large part of it has to do with the growth of social media and how many voters may not engage with mainstream media or news channels anymore and get most of their content, or political content rather, purely based on the single click of a button on their social media feeds. And why is that dangerous, right? Because it leads to you being able to brainwash and influence individuals without much control or restraint, or without many checks and mechanisms in place. So now Cambridge Analytica is able to go and hack your accounts and load your feed with content that they want you to see. And because Facebook didn't have very strong fact checking mechanisms at the time, you're able to influence and brainwash those individuals who may have never really engaged with politics to begin with.
Going along the lines of elections, um, especially this year when both the Democrats and the Republicans were fighting over Senate control, I think one or two states had runoff elections. And when I looked into what the runoff elections essentially do, I was pretty shocked at how outdated those policies were, because this sort of runoff election mechanism came into place during a period when they didn't necessarily want people of color in positions of power in states. And it was quite shocking to see that those sort of practices were still being upheld, even though their co-intentions were already unveiled and revealed. So it just seemed like the whole election system in the US was so outdated to the point where it was just biased in order for people like the former president Donald Trump to win.
I completely agree, and I think this has to do with the systemic racism in the United States of America, right? What do I mean by systemic racism? So before any of the Civil Rights Act, etc., came into play in the 1960s, uh, ever since the time of slavery, rather in the U.S., you had systemic racism, where if you were black, you had to live in a certain neighborhood. If you were white, you were segregated from that. You would have separate schools, separate uh, cafes, restaurants to go to. You would not be able to mingle with anyone of the opposite color, etc. And at that point, right, where you have systemic racism, it's in them, and where you say, look, um, the schools that the whites could go to will be funded more, will have better teachers, and the schools where the blacks could go to would be less well funded and have uh, less proficient teachers and syllabi. At that point, right, it becomes an intergenerational problem because in terms of in terms of wage inequality, etc., it becomes pretty obvious at that point that the ones who went to the better schools, namely the whites, would have access to better jobs and hence better pay, whereas those who went to the less developed schools in the uh, in areas that were segregated exclusively for blacks, you would be less able to access jobs that would have equal pay as the whites. And at that point, you have what I call systemic wage inequality. And why is that? Why is that linked to politics, right? And why is that linked to the U.S. election process? Is I think that was one of the main reasons behind having this electoral college, where the it's not the popular vote. And why is that the case? Because they realize that different regions, even within the same state, have different demographics in terms of the numbers of whites, blacks, Hispanics uh, living there. And at that point, they realized that in order to appear fair and in order to not look as though they were completely disenfranchising and disregarding um, the minority votes, they had to kind of come up with a system to offset that and give equal importance to all voters. And that is where the Electoral College came in. And why is the Electoral College significant? Because if, for example, we ran on the popular vote, like many other countries do, in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have been elected president of the US because she had more popular votes than Donald Trump. But and I think at the point at which you have an entire electoral system that roots itself on these inequalities that were set up by the US themselves, I think at that point it's proof that these US electoral systems are outdated. In my eyes, I have never really agreed with the electoral college system. I understand where it comes from due to the systemic racism and what has ensued since. But I don't think when it comes to a pure democracy, I think it's always one vote per individual, and the one with the most votes has to win. Uh, but I don't think the US can adopt that because of the intergenerational problems that have uh, taken place in the US. And even in terms of having outdated policies, it's very clear, right, that in 2016, one of the reasons why Donald Trump won was because people were sick and tired of these outdated policies that the Democrats were putting up. They were sick and tired of having to send their troops to the Middle East under the premise of the responsibility to protect that Democrats in the US have been known for abusing, not only in 2016, but even when you consider Iraq and the Middle East in the early 2000s as well, under George Bush's tenure. I think it becomes clear that most of these outdated policies could also stem from having outdated institutions under these respective parties. And I think in 2016, many people, moderates themselves, thought of Donald Trump uh, as being a refreshing avenue through which the US could turn to. And I think that was what prompted him into being elected in 2016, although he was a left field pick.
Now, moving away from politics and kind of going into economics. So another topic that was covered heavily by the news was uh, this huge surge in GameStop stocks and how it pretty much resulted in billions of losses for Wall Street firms
Yeah,
and hedge funds, almost quadrupled in
yeah,
value. And all the firms that bet against GameStop ended up
yeah.
losing billions.
When referring to GameStop, and I think I completely agree with everything you've just said, but going back to GameStop, and why that was so relevant and so out of the blue, right, is because, like, and many people have actually asked me this about what is GameStop, right? If you actually look at it on the surface, GameStop is just a place to basically just buy a video game. But on Wall Street, it kind of became a battleground where small investors saw themselves making an epic stand against the 1% of elite investors who kind of monopolize the stock market. But I'm just going to give you all a small 101 about how the stock market, a certain a certain aspect of the stock market, right? Where so usually when it comes to you investing or being involved in the stock market, you would bet in favor of a company's growth, or bet in favor of a company doing well in the future. So you'd you'd and that is the conventional style of being involved in the stock market. But what they did was, prior to this whole explosion that took place, GameStop stock had been struggling for a long time, right? The company had been losing money for years as sales of video games went online, etc. And I think its stock fell for 6 years straight before rebounding slightly in 2020. So what they did was, because they anticipated that GameStop will continue to decline, uh, professional investors would make bets that GameStop stock will continue to decline further. And this is what you call short sales in the stock market, where investors borrow a share and sell it in hopes of buying it back later at a lower price and pocketing the difference. That is what short sales are all about. And as of recently, and inevitably, GameStop became one of the most shorted stocks on Wall Street. But why was there a bit of a shock? So you'd expect them to continue to decline, and for these investors to be better off following selling the stock and buying it back at a lower price and pocketing the difference. But this did not result, because their GameStop stock began rising sharply after one of their co-founders joined the company's board. And if I'm not mistaken, its shares jumped from roughly $19 to uh, its shares jumped to $20 from being roughly at around $17 or $18 on the 10th or 11th of Jan. And that minimal $2 increase is huge, hugely significant in the stock market, right? So what this meant was, small investors were capitalizing on this increase, and they were exhorting each other online to keep GameStop stock rolling higher. And what was uh, this resulted in all these investors now immediately trying to scramble out their bets, because they realized that these short sellers weren't going to gain from this difference that they anticipated, because the stock price was rising. So as they tried to scramble out their bets, right, they had to buy shares in order to do that. And through buying shares, it created a bit of a feedback loop, because it accelerated the momentum even more for GameStop. And as short sellers of GameStop were already down more than 4 or 5 billion by the start of the year, through them continuing to buy shares, the stock price of GameStop continued to increase. And this is where smaller investors benefited, because these professional investors had a bit of a blunder through predicting that their short sales would result in giving them some profit. So short sales is a very risky type of strategy to go about when you invest in the stock market. And as it proved to be the case with GameStop. See, and I'm also now trying to look at potential consequences. I want to talk about other potential consequences of uh, GameStop. Like when it comes to hedge fund holdings, right? Most have fallen below their 50 to 100-day averages purely as a result of what transpired earlier this month. And there might even be a time when investors who don't already hold stock in the hedge fund, for example, in the Goldman VIP 10 hedge fund, they might start getting interested in establishing positions. And this is where you have the norm for investing in the stock market, where there's a norm that my uncle once told me that it's a good market axiom to live by, that it pays to be greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy. And this is where I link it to how matters could even be worse for those who've now started selling their GameStop short, because the kind of rapid, large, unexpected losses that they've incurred might imply an existential crisis for hedge funds going forward, because this was a huge blow to reputed hedge funds going forward, because this was a huge lapse in terms of their predictive skills and a huge lapse in terms of them predicting the potential stock price of GameStop. And I think at that point, you start deterring individuals from engaging with the stock market as a whole or for engaging with hedge funds, because this was a huge black mark on not only those professional investors short, uh, who shorted GameStop, but also on the whole premise of how hedge funds operate.
I also wanted to talk about something that started gaining a bit of attention in the recent past. Bitcoin has always been, the talk where prices soar and then they fall again, and this is a never-ending cycle. Like the whole crypto market now has kind of gotten saturated with new forms of, transactions like Ethereum or even Dogecoin, which started off as a joke and now has actually gained quite a significant amount of value. And I couldn't help but notice that maybe since the stock market and cryptocurrency and things like investments are widely available to everyone now because of the internet, it's almost as if the risk and volatility of cryptocurrencies and stocks have been raised to a level where anything could happen and the market completely
That's very
unpredictable.
true. And I think one thing I will do now is perhaps give you all an outline, give all our listeners an outline about why Bitcoins became so popular to begin with, and why you had the saturation that you spoke of earlier, right? And this I did in my third year, because for those of you who don't know me, I'm studying economics at St. Andrews. So in my third year, there was a module that kind of had a huge emphasis on cryptocurrency, bitcoins, etc. So there are 3 or 4 main reasons why bitcoins are so popular, right? The first thing about it is scarcity, right? And for those of you who do econ, you know at the point at which anything is scarce or relatively scarce, their value increases significantly. And one of the developers of Bitcoins at the onset stated that only approximately 18 to 20 million Bitcoins will ever be created. And at that point, right, and with the reassurance that the protocol will never be changed, that kind of incentivizes individuals to start engaging with bitcoins because of it being relatively scarce. Whereas when it comes to other things, like, for example, when it comes to things like actual cash, like physical cash, there's a never ending supply, right? There's potentially a never ending supply, because if you start printing currency, as some governments have done, the value of that currency decreases. Whereas with bitcoins now, when you have that assurance that there's a limit on the number of bitcoins that will ever be created, the value of those bitcoins increase. Secondly, right, I think it is important to realize that there's a lot of divisibility when it comes to bitcoins, as opposed to like other forms of physical cash, etc. Because bitcoins, if I'm not mistaken, and if I can vaguely remember this, they have you can divide bitcoins up to 6 to 7 decimal points. And at that point, right, it allows the bitcoins to be distributed throughout a global economy. And then you have 2 more things that I'll touch upon, one being utility, um, and the other being transportability. Like when it came to bitcoins and cryptocurrency to begin with, why it became so popular was because of this whole blockchain technology, right? Where the blockchain system was decentralized, which meant no parties participating in the market needed to establish a trust to make the transaction. And that kind of reduces the time lag of revolving Bitcoins. Whereas when you go to a bank to take out a loan, for example, you have to build that sense of trust with the banker and yourself to make sure that he gives you a loan at a low interest rate, right? And to make sure that you're not a high risk borrower. And the final point, right, is durability, right? It's like if you look at cash or like fiat currencies, they can easily be torn, burned, or sometimes rendered unusable. For example, the Scottish pound note in Scotland, like the £10 Scottish pound note that is released by the Bank of uh, by the by the Bank of Scotland, uh, cannot be used in England, for example, because they don't render it uh, legitimate. And at that point, when digital forms of currency are not susceptible to such physical harms, it becomes way more popular because it could practically be used anywhere. So that is what contributes to the sense of saturation that you spoke of and results in all the consequences that you eloquently highlighted early on.
Uh, well, moving away from crypto and diving into the headlines, what exactly do you feel about how countries have, handled COVID, handled the distribution of
Well,
the vaccine?
well, Vipulesh, so I returned from St Andrews, Scotland on the eve of quarantine being enforced in Sri Lanka. So this was on the 14th of March 2020, before we even had uh, any cases to begin with in Colombo. Uh, and one thing I really admired and respected about how our country was dealing with it was there was a sense of it, our government being very proactive. Because as I left Edinburgh uh, on the 14th morning, there was no social distancing at the airport. Hardly anyone wore masks, even though there were significant clusters in Scotland and the UK at the time. Um, so it seemed as though the UK government was being very complacent at the onset. I don't think they realized the full gravity of the situation at the time, and it was a breath of fresh air when I came to Sri Lanka. And as soon as I landed, we were sent through screening tests. We were asked to wear masks. We could not remove our masks till we left the airport. And then the very next day, on the 15th of March, there was enforced quarantine for 2 weeks for any returnees coming in. And it was very interesting to see how developing countries were being way more proactive about COVID than the Western developed world. And I think this shows when you look at the number of cases and the number and the death rates in these respective countries. The US and UK continue to struggle with the rampant uh, increase in the number of cases each day. Whereas, yes, it's unfortunate that we've had this second wave in Colombo and in Sri Lanka in general. But up until that point, uh, we were handling it very well. And I think when it comes to how countries have dealt, I think this is a clear sign of how developing countries dealt with it a lot better than the developed world. Now, moving on to vaccines and the spread of vaccines, this is where affordability, etc., comes in, right? It's inevitable that the less developed countries would not have the doses to distribute to its entire population just yet, and this is where it's important for groups like the WHO, the IMF, World Bank, etc., to get together and try to come up with packages for these countries to make sure that they have the facilities and the minimum requirements to make sure that their citizens' safety is upheld. For example, the first doses of vaccines that we got to Sri Lanka, the COVID AstraZeneca vaccines, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines rather, were not bought by the Sri Lankan government, but they were gifted by the Indian government um, to Sri Lanka. So it's important that you have bilateral ties like that to ensure that there are sufficient doses of the vaccine being presented to these countries who clearly may not have the means to afford it themselves. But it's pretty nice. It's pretty refreshing also to see that within a matter of days, programs have been implemented to vaccinate individuals, and that the numbers of those vaccinated are already in the thousands. And it's also it also brings a positive light to these vaccines that have been tested prior, to know that you don't have serious malfunctions of these vaccines, or that there are no negative reports, significant negative reports about individuals who've taken the vaccines. Yes, of course, it's inevitable, as is the case for the polio vaccine or the MMR vaccine. It's inevitable that there will be individuals who don't, who are not as receptive to the vaccine as others, who will have worse side effects. But it's important that countries now start focusing on vaccines, because it's a bit of a trade-off, right? You could either invest more time and energy towards making sure you vaccinate your individual or your citizens, or and the expenses related to testing, because it's a bit of a trade-off. The more you start vaccinating, potentially the less you'll need to test your population. So I think it's important that countries do start actively vaccinating their citizens to make sure that uh, individuals' interests are seen to. But in light of all these new strains, it's going to be interesting to see how researchers and uh, creators of these vaccines alike adjust and adapt to all these new strains that are being found.
With regards to the trade-off between vaccinating and testing, there's been a noticeable decrease in COVID COVID cases in throughout the world in the last few months, and countries have started reducing restrictions, opening. The U.S. at least has opened uh, states up for outdoor dining and things like that. And with new strains, especially now entering the US, and with less testing probably being the cause of, not being able to document as many cases of COVID as they did before, does it seem like a plausible idea to, open up countries, especially when there are two or at least one deadlier virus variant that's
So this
spreading
is where
across the world?
so this is where we start talking about the
Yeah.
new normal, right? I think where there is something called COVID fatigue now, right? And this has impacted many countries where you can't remain being in lockdown for too long. There are economic consequences, socio-cultural consequences. For example, economic consequences are, so you have your daily wage earners who start losing out significantly during lockdown because they're unemployment or they're furloughed by their uh, by their employees. You have, by the employers rather, other problems, right? Like socio-cultural problems, like an significant increase in domestic abuse or domestic violence rates, because you're now uh, trapped within these four walls of your safety networks physically, through being in lockdown and through being coerced into being in your homes. But looking at it from an economic standpoint, right? If you look at developing countries like Sri Lanka, for example, who rely very heavily on their tourism industry and the tourism sector for their GDP and growth, right? We need to realize that there's only a certain length of time through which you can continue to close down your country at that point, because at the point at which we there has been proof, right? During the 30-year civil war, our GDP growth rate uh, was undermined significantly due to insecurities result due to tourists being deterred from coming to Sri Lanka due to terrorism. And then following the 2019 Easter Sunday attacks, we had the same decline in the number of tourists coming in. And now in the post-COVID environment, it's important that we try and get that sector up and running again, because it's a sector that we breathe off uh, for the well-being of our economy. And likewise, for many other developing countries, it's very difficult to remain in lockdown for sustained periods of time. But having said that, right, if you look at countries that have dealt with COVID brilliantly, you look at the trans-Tasman boundaries, right? You look at New Zealand, you look at Australia. They imposed a very strict lockdown for a significant period of time, ensured that there was no community spread in those countries, continue to keep their borders closed. And now you have some form of normalcy being restored in Auckland, Wellington, etc., where life is back to normal. But I think New Zealand and Australia are better off because their dependence on the tourist sector, etc., or their dependence on having open borders is less significant than countries like Sri Lanka, whose strength of the economy continues to rely upon having tourists coming in and out of the country and having those inflows on that front.
What exactly is your take on vaccine tourism? With the 1% traveling to remote areas in order to get vaccines, or pretty much just entering developed states in order to obtain a vaccine and
I
kind of
feel
jump the
like,
line.
and this is something I want to talk about as well in terms of the link between vaccines and tourism, right? Find Times on The Economist. I think it's a pretty good read. There were a couple of articles on how countries, like when I'm trying to draw the links between vaccines and tourism, where now you'll have to have a vaccine stamp on your passport before you enter certain countries. And I think that will be the norm going forward, not only to ensure that tourism is upheld, but also to ensure the safety and well-being of your locals, and that your locals aren't compromised by having tourists coming in. So I think at the point at which tourists have to have a vaccine stamp before they disembark in your country, I think that gives a sense of safety or an assurance to your locals that there is no potential cause for concern. Um, and I think that will be the norm going forward. And I think even for anti-vaxxers out there who are still very reluctant to go and uh, vaccinate themselves, I think it's important to realize that those will be certain things you will have to take into account. For example, the next time you embark on a flight, perhaps you may have to have a vaccine stamp with you before you disembark elsewhere. And I think those are realities that we'll have to come to terms with now. And I think we've covered a quite
Yeah.
a variety of topics which are very interesting. And I thank you once again for having me. And it was a great podcast to be a part of.
Thanks for being on the podcast, Viren. Thank you for,
No, just say
I don't know,
thank you.
man.
No, just say thanks to
Do
our
you have
listeners for joining us for this interesting podcast. And we look forward to having you next season or something along those lines.
it's not what to say, it's
Yeah.
just me saying it that just kills me. Anyway, thank you, Viren, for joining us on the podcast today. And I guess till next
Brilliant.
season.